The night air was thick with mist, the kind that made headlights glow like ghostly orbs in the distance. On a quiet highway leading into the city, a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class cruised smoothly along the road, its polished surface reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. At the wheel sat Jonathan Ellis, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was returning from an inspiring lecture at Columbia University, where he had shared his journey in law, one marked by perseverance, integrity, and the fight for justice. Now, he was simply looking forward to a quiet night at home, unwinding with a glass of wine and some Miles Davis playing in the background. But fate had other plans. A sudden flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp blare of a police siren. Jonathan's brows furrowed. He knew he wasn't speeding, there were no traffic violations, no erratic movements. So why was he being pulled over? Sighing, he signaled and pulled onto the shoulder, cutting the engine. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel as he waited. He had experienced stops like this before, a successful black man in an expensive car. It was an equation that some officers found suspicious. A moment later, a uniformed officer stepped out of the patrol car and approached. He was a tall, stocky man in his early 40s, his posture rigid with an air of authority. The name on his badge read Sergeant Mark Reynolds. Jonathan rolled down his window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit drilled into him by years of experience. "Good evening, officer," he said calmly. Reynolds didn't return the greeting. Instead, his eyes swept over the interior of the car, then back to Jonathan's face. "License and registration," he said, his voice curt and impersonal. Jonathan nodded, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve the documents. As he handed them over, he asked evenly, "May I ask why I was stopped?" Reynolds took the papers but didn't answer. Instead, he studied the license for a moment before letting out a small, dismissive scoff. "This your car?" he asked, a smirk forming on his lips. Jonathan didn't react. He had heard the question too many times before. "Yes, the registration is there." Reynolds snorted. "Nice ride for a guy like you." His gaze hardened. "What do you do for a living?" Jonathan kept his expression neutral, though a flicker of irritation crossed his mind. "I work in government." Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head. "Government job, huh? And you can afford this?" He took a step closer to the window. "Something doesn't add up." Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had spent decades upholding justice, ensuring fairness in the legal system. Yet here he was, being judged not by his actions but by the color of his skin and the car he drove. "Officer," he said, maintaining his composure, "your job is to enforce the law, not speculate about my finances." Reynolds' expression darkened. "Are you lecturing me?" He leaned in slightly. "We have the right to question anyone who looks suspicious, and you, sir, look suspicious." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he refused to let emotion take over. "Then what exactly am I suspected of?" Reynolds smirked again. "How about drugs? Smuggling? Maybe a stolen vehicle?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "If you have reasonable suspicion, you are welcome to check my records. Otherwise, I believe you need a warrant to search my car." Reynolds tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You think you know the law better than me?" A tense silence filled the air. The mist around them felt heavier, as if the night itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Then Reynolds took a step back and rested a hand near his holster. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice sharper now, demanding. Jonathan could feel the shift. The situation was escalating, and he knew that one wrong move could turn it deadly. He met Reynolds' gaze, his voice steady. "Officer, let's not make this worse than it needs to be." But Reynolds wasn't backing down. His fingers twitched near his holster, his stance aggressive. "Out. Now." Jonathan sighed, recognizing that reasoning wouldn't work with a man like this. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the door handle. As he stepped out, the cold night air wrapped around him like an unwelcome presence. Reynolds took a step closer, his smirk now fully replaced with a look of control. Hands on the car. Jonathan knew where this was headed. He had seen it happen to others, had read about cases like this in court, but he never thought he'd be living one. Jonathan Ellis stood beside his car, the cold metal pressing against his fingertips as he placed his hands flat on the sleek surface. The mist around them was thick, blurring the edges of the road, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sergeant Mark Reynolds took his time, circling Jonathan like a predator sizing up its prey. The officer's hand remained near his holster, his posture radiating control. "I don't like your attitude," Reynolds muttered, stepping in closer. "Something about you just doesn't sit right." Jonathan remained composed. He had spent decades mastering the art of patience, first as a lawyer, then as a judge, and now as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He knew how power worked, how some men wielded it responsibly while others used it as a weapon. Reynolds ran a hand over Jonathan's pockets in a rough, unnecessary pat-down. Jonathan didn't flinch. He had nothing to hide, and more importantly, he refused to give Reynolds the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. "This is unnecessary," Jonathan said evenly. "You've checked my documents. Everything is in order. There's no reason for this." Reynolds let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, I decide what's necessary, buddy." The way he said "buddy" made Jonathan's stomach tighten. It wasn't a friendly term, it was condescending, laced with unspoken venom. Jonathan exhaled. "Then I want this recorded in your report. Every detail." Reynolds paused mid-pat-down, then let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Report? You think anyone actually reads those?" Jonathan turned his head slightly, meeting Reynolds' gaze. "They will read this one." For the first time, something flickered in Reynolds' expression, something that looked like unease. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by renewed arrogance. "You talk a big game," Reynolds sneered, "but out here, you're just another guy in a car I pulled over. You don't get special treatment." Jonathan's eyes hardened. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the law to be followed." Reynolds' jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who wasn't intimidated by him. Then, suddenly, something slipped from Jonathan's pocket, a small leather case. It landed on the ground, flipping open to reveal his official identification card. Reynolds glanced down and, for a brief second, his smirk faltered. Chief Justice Jonathan Ellis, the highest-ranking judge in the United States, a man who had shaped legal precedent, ruled on historic cases, and had the power to influence the entire justice system. But Reynolds didn't fully process it. He barely glanced at the name before shrugging dismissively, pretending he hadn't seen it. "Doesn't change a thing," he muttered. Jonathan took a slow breath. "Officer, if you continue this, you will face consequences, not just from me, but from the entire legal system." Reynolds stepped closer, pushing him against the car with more force than necessary. The air between them was thick with tension. "You think you can threaten me?" Reynolds hissed. "You think dropping fancy words about the law will scare me?" Jonathan held his gaze. "I don't need to threaten you, officer. Your own actions will ruin you." Reynolds' eyes darkened. He hated this. He hated how calm Jonathan remained. He hated that he couldn't intimidate him. And in that moment, his anger overpowered his logic. Reynolds reached for his gun. The movement was swift, reckless. He drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Jonathan's chest. For the first time, Jonathan's heartbeat quickened, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. "Are you insane?" A voice suddenly cut through the night. Both men turned. Across the road, a man was standing on the sidewalk, holding up his phone, recording everything. His face was partially obscured by the fog, but the red recording light on his screen was unmistakable. Reynolds' face twisted in fury. "Stop filming. This is police business." The man didn't move. He kept his phone raised, silent. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Now the power dynamic was shifting. "Officer Reynolds," Jonathan said, voice firm, "put the gun down." Reynolds' hands trembled slightly, but his ego refused to let him back down. "You think this means anything? I haven't done anything wrong." Jonathan's voice was like steel. "Pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed citizen during a routine traffic stop? That's a crime." Reynolds' breathing was heavy. He was cornered, and he knew it. And then another siren wailed in the distance. A second patrol car pulled up behind Reynolds' cruiser. The driver's side door swung open, and Lieutenant Lisa Carter stepped out, her sharp gaze immediately taking in the situation. Her eyes flicked to the gun in Reynolds' hands. "Mark, what the hell are you doing?" she demanded. Reynolds stiffened. "Lieutenant, lower your weapon." Her voice was cold, authoritative. For a moment, time stood still. Then, with a slow, reluctant movement, Reynolds finally lowered his gun. Jonathan remained still, his breathing steady, but inside, he knew the real battle had only just begun. Lieutenant Lisa Carter kept her hand on her holster as she stepped closer, her sharp eyes locking onto Sergeant Mark Reynolds. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The misty night, the black luxury car, the Chief Justice standing firm, and the reckless officer who had just pulled a gun on an innocent man. "What the hell is going on here?" Carter's voice was firm, demanding an immediate answer. Reynolds swallowed hard, still gripping his gun, though it was now lowered. "Lieutenant, this man was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job." Jonathan Ellis finally moved, brushing off his coat. "Your job? Your job is to enforce the law, not abuse it." His voice was measured, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. Carter's gaze shifted to Jonathan. For the first time, there was something familiar about him, his calm presence, his commanding tone. Then she noticed something on the ground, Jonathan's identification card. She bent down, picked it up, and read the name, and froze. Her face went pale for a split second before she turned to Reynolds, eyes blazing. "Mark, do you have any idea who this is?" Reynolds frowned. "What are you talking about?" Carter held up the ID, practically shoving it in his face. "This is Chief Justice Jonathan Ellis, the head of the Supreme Court." A long, suffocating silence. Reynolds' face drained of color. His eyes darted back to Jonathan, as if seeing him for the first time. The realization hit like a freight train. The man he had just harassed, insulted, and pulled a gun on was one of the most powerful figures in the country. Jonathan held his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You were so eager to judge me based on my car and the color of my skin," he said, voice quiet but firm, "yet you never bothered to ask the one thing that actually mattered, who I am." Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. His arrogance, his bravado, it all collapsed in an instant. Carter took a sharp breath and turned to him. "Mark, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." I didn't know," Reynolds stammered, his hands trembling now, his mind racing for a way out. "If he's the Chief Justice, why didn't he just say so?" Jonathan let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "So I have to announce my status to be treated fairly? Is that how the law works in your world?" Reynolds had no answer. Meanwhile, across the street, the man recording the entire encounter remained silent but steady, his phone still aimed at them. Then Carter's radio crackled. "Dispatch to all units, civilian reports of an armed officer threatening an unarmed driver on Route 19. Proceed with caution." Carter's jaw clenched. The report had already gone out. This wasn't just between them anymore, this was about to become a national scandal. She took a deep breath before turning back to Jonathan. "Sir, I need to formally apologize for what happened tonight. This should never have occurred." Jonathan simply nodded. Apologies don't erase abuse of power. Action does. Carter hesitated, then slowly turned to Reynolds. "Sergeant Mark Reynolds, I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. Hand over your badge and weapon." Reynolds' eyes widened in shock. "Lisa, wait, now." For the first time, Reynolds realized there was no way out. He had spent years acting untouchable, believing he could get away with anything. But now, the entire world was watching, and his career, it was already over. Sergeant Mark Reynolds stood frozen, his face pale under the flashing red and blue lights. The weight of Lieutenant Lisa Carter's words hit him like a sledgehammer. "Hand over your badge and weapon." His fingers tightened around his holster, but there was no point in resisting. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he unfastened his duty belt, removed his gun, and handed it over. The badge came next, its metallic surface gleaming under the streetlights as it landed in Carter's outstretched palm. It was over. A man who had once strutted through the streets, confident in his untouchable authority, was now just another disgraced officer under investigation. Jonathan Ellis watched without emotion. This was not about personal revenge, this was about justice. Across the street, the bystander filming the incident lowered his phone, checking the screen. The video was still rolling. Without a word, he tapped upload and sent it directly to social media. Within minutes, the world would see everything. By the time Jonathan Ellis reached home that night, his phone was already buzzing with calls, texts, and emails. He ignored them all for now, instead pouring himself a glass of bourbon and sinking into his leather armchair. On his TV screen, the news was already covering the video. Shocking footage emerges of a Supreme Court justice being harassed at a routine traffic stop. The officer involved, Sergeant Mark Reynolds, has been placed on immediate suspension. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Abuse of power caught on camera, Justice Ellis speaks out." Social media was on fire. The video had gone viral, spreading across Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in record time. Millions of people were watching, sharing, and commenting. This is why we say police reform is needed. Imagine if he weren't a Supreme Court justice, what would have happened then? Reynolds deserves to be fired and prosecuted. Ellis handled this like a true leader, calm, collected, and powerful. The outrage was immediate. Protest groups, activists, and civil rights organizations began calling for action. The hashtag Justice for Ellis trended within hours. Meanwhile, the police department scrambled to control the damage. The next morning, at a hastily arranged press conference, the city's police chief stood before a row of cameras, his face tight, his voice measured. "What happened last night was unacceptable. We hold our officers to the highest standards, and Sergeant Reynolds' actions do not reflect the values of this department. He has been suspended, and a full investigation is underway." A reporter's voice rang out. "Will he face criminal charges?" The chief hesitated. "That decision will be made after the investigation." But the public wasn't buying it. The pressure was mounting. The mayor issued a statement condemning Reynolds' actions. The Department of Justice announced a formal review of the case. Even the president was asked about it in a press briefing. Meanwhile, Jonathan remained silent. He had seen this pattern before, an officer caught abusing power, a wave of outrage, promises of reform. But would anything really change? That was the real question. At his home, Mark Reynolds sat hunched over his kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. The news played on his TV, showing his own face on every channel, his name being discussed by reporters, politicians, and legal experts. His career was destroyed. His phone vibrated with messages, but he didn't dare check them. The police union had distanced themselves from him. His own colleagues refused to defend him. Even his family wasn't answering his calls. But the worst part? His name would never be forgotten. No matter where he went, he would always be remembered as the officer who pulled a gun on the Chief Justice. And that was a sentence he could never escape. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation as people waited for the verdict. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, every seat was filled, activists, legal experts, and everyday citizens who had followed the case from the moment the video went viral. At the defendant's table, Mark Reynolds sat motionless, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by exhaustion and nervous tension. His hands were clasped together, as if he were holding on to some last hope that the system would somehow save him. Across the room, Jonathan Ellis sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. He had not pushed for revenge, only accountability. This case had become bigger than either of them. It was a moment of reckoning for a justice system that had long tolerated abuses of power. Today, at least, that system had to prove it could hold its own accountable. The judge, one of Jonathan's colleagues but an impartial one, cleared his throat and looked at Reynolds. In the case of the state versus Mark Reynolds, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Reynolds' face fell, his shoulders sagged. He barely reacted as the judge continued. Mark Reynolds is hereby sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for abuse of power, unlawful use of a firearm, and civil rights violations. It was over for Reynolds. The fall had been swift and merciless. He had once thought himself untouchable, now he was a disgraced former officer, stripped of his badge, his reputation, and his future. As officers moved in to escort him away, he finally turned toward Jonathan. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Jonathan saw no defiance in them, no arrogance, just regret. Then Reynolds was gone. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Protesters and supporters alike had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," "No one is above the law," and "End police abuse." The energy was electric, a moment of victory in a battle far from over. As Jonathan stepped out, reporters swarmed toward him, microphones raised, voices overlapping in a chaotic rush. "Chief Justice Ellis, do you believe this verdict is enough?" one journalist asked. Jonathan paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before answering. Justice is not just about one case. It's about ensuring what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. He glanced at the cameras, knowing his words would reach millions. This is not just about me. It's about every person who has been stopped unfairly, treated with suspicion for no reason other than prejudice. One verdict won't fix the system, but it's a start. The crowd erupted into applause. The pressure from this case had already forced changes, new police policies, mandatory body cameras, and nationwide discussions on racial profiling. It wasn't just about punishing one corrupt officer, it was about demanding change from a system that had failed too many for too long. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his study, the glow of the television casting shadows across the room. The coverage of Reynolds' sentencing was everywhere. His phone buzzed, a text from an old friend, "You did it. This case is going to change things." Jonathan took a deep breath. Maybe it was just another case in the long fight for justice. Or maybe it was the moment that made real change possible. Either way, he had done what he had always sworn to do: stand for the truth, demand justice, and never back down. As he took a sip of bourbon, he knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning.